I'd been trekking through the swamps of southern Quatla for 4 days now, and already the heat was getting to me. The heat here was nothing like the dry plains that stretch out over Sibir. Whilst Quatla was technically cooler, the air here sticks to you, and its humidity stops you cooling down, leaving you at the mercy of a boiling mire. Luckily, it wasn't the first time I'd been in an environment like this. I knew better than to wade through the knee-deep waters. Well, they weren't deep, but they were dark. For one thing, you couldn't see the bottom of the pools, but more importantly, you couldn't see what was in the water. Swamps tend to teem with all kinds of life, as tall as the tallest trees and as small as the smallest leeches. The sun had just begun to set, the orange light reflecting off of the back of a wet toad caked in bog slime. It was really time to set up camp. So I climbed up a small hill to get away from the water and pitched on wooden legs to get, above the soil. Just as I'd finished, the sun had disappeared and the sky was getting dark, so I lit a small fire, which I'd hid behind a black sheet as not to disturb the hinky-punk. As the sky grew dark, I began to spot small dots of light dancing between the trees in the distance. Blue, green, orange, yellow. They were the lights of the hinky-punk blinking in and out of view as I relaxed by the dying flames of the fire that kept me warm in the sudden drop of temperature. It's unbelievable to think that the swamp got so hot during the day, and by night it just drops so quickly. It wasn't as cold as Fisky or even some of Cree and Doran, but the change made you really feel it. As the evening stretched on, it felt like the hinky-punk were becoming less wary of me, or maybe more curious. It was hard to say. Their lights felt like they were coming closer, especially the yellow ones. It was almost as if they were swaying between the trunks of the swamp to get a better look at me, to try and figure out what the strange new mound on wooden legs was. At the risk of causing a disturbance and attracting some bigger and more dangerous things, I decided to leave the curious lights alone. But with them getting closer and closer to the camp, I didn't dare go to sleep either. The night stretched on around me, and I grew weary from the day's hike. I began to fall under the spell of the dancing lights, watching them play atop the waters of the bog, and seeing the lights softly flicker off the greens and browns of the plants. It was enchanting. The two yellow hinky-punk that were watching my camp so intently had gotten much closer by this point. But they moved so slowly, so stealthily, they were so easy to ignore. My eyelids grew heavy. The ambience of the swamp was so peaceful, the lights were dreamlike, and the air was as warm as a blanket. But something began to stir me out of my dizzying tiredness. I could hear, like, a rolling, grumbling sound. I pulled myself back to my senses. It must have been my stomach. So I roused myself to go get something to eat. But I heard it again. I didn't think that was my stomach. And actually, I wasn't hungry. The heat of the swamp does weird things, including suppressing an appetite. So I stood up and had a look around. The hinky-punk were quite a ways off, except for the two yellow ones. They were so much closer now. I stamped out the small campfire, smothering the last of its embers. And suddenly, the two yellow hinky-punk just disappeared. Just as the growling got louder. They weren't hinky-punk at all. Bursting out of the water with a tremendous roar came a homodile, its yellow eyes reflecting the little light emanating from my camp. It stood enormously tall on its hind legs and leapt up towards me with uncanny speed. If it wasn't for the black tarp I erected for the campfire, that would have been it. That would have been the end. I leapt off the side of the wooden camp supports and ran across the dry land, the swamp water threatening to impede me on both sides. Just as the homodile got loose on my campsite, I dove through some tightly packed trees and didn't stop. I knew better than to stop. I ran as I heard the sounds of the giant behind me. Its enormous claws had begun to tear at the trees. I bought myself a little time, but not enough to stop. As the distance between us increased, I heard some, tear. A tear of the growth, straight out of the ground. A shadow in the moonlight eclipsed my head as a tree sailed over me, hitting a few trees ahead and tumbling to the floor. I slipped underneath it, and suddenly the forest was silent. but I kept running.